Good morning, and welcome all to the 12th Annual Summer Conference organized by the Oxford University Centre for Business Taxation. My name is John Vella, and I am an Associate Professor of Taxation at the Faculty of Law here at Oxford, and I'm also a Fellow at the Centre for Business Taxation. So I'd like to start the conference by making some introductory remarks before we launch into our first session. So we're living in a period of seemingly incessant developments in international corporate taxation. When you think about all the developments we've seen in the past few years, it's really been incredible. So just think about all the developments we've had. We've had country-by-country reporting, developments in exchange of information, the creation of the inclusive framework and its expansion, a number of unilateral measures such as the diverted profits tax in the UK, the multilateral instrument, an EU directive in direct taxation, and US corporate tax reform. These are the ones that come to mind immediately. It's really incredible that we've seen so many developments in a relatively short space of time. And it's actually hard to keep on top of everything, right? So at times when I'm struggling to try and keep on top of everything, I think I'm like perhaps in the second circle of Dante's hell. And just as you might recall, the souls in the second circle of Dante's hell are condemned for eternity to be blown by incessant winds without aim or purpose. But perhaps that's too negative a point on which to start this conference. Okay, but on a more serious note, I think if we, in a different time, each of these developments would dominate our attention for a protracted period. And I'm sure most of you here are trying to keep on top of these developments, but the prime focus of the international corporate tax community seems to have moved on from these developments to the following question: how do we address the challenges posed by digitalization? And as we shall hear today, especially in the first session, countries' views on how to answer this question are coming to three. So there are three groups. The first group believes that there is no need for further reform to address the challenges posed by digitalization. There is a second group which believes that there is a need for reform to address the challenges posed by digitalization, but this reform should be limited to highly digitalized businesses. And the third group of countries believes that there is a need to address, for reform to address the challenges posed by digitalization and globalization more generally. But crucially, this group of countries believes that the reform should not be limited to highly digitalized businesses, but should be extended to the system as a whole. So this, to me, seems to be a really critical point for international corporate taxation. We could have critical reform, significant reform, which goes beyond what we've seen in the past few years. We could even see reform which actually alters the fundamental structure, which alters at least some aspects of the fundamental structure of the system, depending, of course, on which of these three views prevails. So we're at this critical point, and there are a number of very difficult questions to answer. And I thought I could list just a few of them. Maybe we can consider, in the hope that we'd consider them during the conference today. So first and foremost, should we have reform that is limited to highly digitalized businesses, or should we reform the system as a whole? Second question, should we reform the way we allocate taxing rights amongst countries? And the question then becomes, if we do, how do we reform the system? Should we allocate any taxing rights to market countries, to the place of destination? A third question is, as you know, the proposals being considered by the EU Commission and favored by some countries, and the report produced by the OECD is based on the principles that profits should be taxed where value is creation. So this is a really central principle. The question then becomes, is this principle conceptually justified? And secondly, can we design a sensible system which is coherent and comprehensive following on from this principle? Another question is, what happens if we don't get reform? what happens if we don't get reform amongst the 116 countries which form the inclusive framework? Will that mean that countries will undertake unilateral measures? And if so, what would that mean for the future of international cooperation and coordination? But even if we do have consensus in the inclusive framework, if let's say we have consensus on the creation of a digital PE, would that digital PE assuage political concerns and provide stability? Or will there be existing pressures which will somehow lead to reopen the debate on whether we should have reform in the medium or long term? And finally, how do the current political winds, which are very particular in some countries, affect this debate? So these are just some of the very difficult questions we have to face, and I suspect we won't all agree on the right answer to these questions by the end of the conference. And of course, there are many other questions. But hopefully, what we can do in this conference is start exploring some of them. So I'd like to close my remarks by thanking our speakers for accepting to attend, to participate in our conference. And I'd also like to thank all of you for coming here today. And I invite you to participate during the Q&A session, which will follow each of our panels as actively as possible, because this will really enrich the debate. So, as I said, these are not normal times. And I don't only say this because England made it past the group stage of the World Cup. We do seem to be at a very critical point in time for the international corporate tax system. And this requires very careful thought and debate, and hopefully this conference will contribute to this. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm the chair for the first session, and I'll introduce the three speakers we have. So the first speaker we have is Valeska Gronert, who's the head of Sector for Economic Analysis of Tax Efficiency at the European Commission. The second speaker is John Peterson, who's the head of Aggressive Tax Planning at the OECD. And the third speaker is Michael Lennard, who's the chief of International Tax Cooperation at the United Nations. So I actually forgot to say this in my presentation, but the structure of the conference today is as follows. In the first session, we're going to discuss the state of play. So we're going to have speakers from the OECD, the UN, and the Commission, and they're each going to describe and discuss the work done on digitalization by their institutions in the past few months. In the second session, we have representatives of the finance ministries of the UK, Germany, Ireland, and we have a US tax professor. And they're each going to describe and discuss the position of their countries on the question of digitalization. And we suspect these positions might not be fully aligned, so hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion there. As you know, the main two proposals on the table are one for a turnover tax and secondly for some kind of digital PE. So in the third session, we shall look at these two proposals from a legal, economic, and business perspective. And in the fourth and final session, we shall have a round table where our panelists will address two questions. Firstly, where do they think we will be in 2 years' time, so when the OECD publishes its final report? And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, where do they think we should be in 2 years' time? So that's the plan for the day. And we'll start by looking at the state of play, as I said, by representatives from the Commission, OECD, and the UN. And we start with Valeska Gronert from the Commission.
Yes, hello. Good morning, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to explain a bit our proposals here and the rationale behind, and also for organizing or dedicating this day to this important topic. I'd like to start actually with describing a bit the underlying problem and how we see it. So this is basically a summary of the more qualitative aspects of the underlying problem that you would also find in our impact assessment. So what is the problem? The problem is that today's rules of how to allocate profit rights internationally are not really fit for the digital economy. So these rules, the current tax rules, they are mostly laid down in bilateral tax treaties, and these treaties determine when does a country get a taxing right if a company is not a tax resident in that country. So, I mean, most of you will know this. I'm going to say this anyway. So these are the so-called permanent establishment rules, and today these are still mostly, maybe not entirely, but mostly based on physical criteria. So a company needs a plant, a branch, an office, something like that in a country, for that country to get a right over on the profits of that company. And then secondly, once that right is established, you also need to determine how much profits is that country allowed to tax. So the profit attribution rules, and these today are still based mostly, although not entirely, on an analysis of traditional factors that go into the value creation or profit generation in the company. And that is very much in contrast to what we see as the drive towards the digital economy. So we have an increased user contribution to value creation and other non-traditional factors that contribute to value creation. An increased use of knowledge, data, and tangible assets, all very hard to value. We have more complex and more integrated global value chains and data as a new source of revenue. And then at the top here is what we see as the main problems that arise from this, the main consequences. And the first one is the difficulty to tax certain activities, at least in those jurisdictions where companies are not tax residents. And a secondary problem to that is that this also creates more opportunities for tax avoidance. Although we are not emphasizing this a lot in this proposal, but it's true that if companies have more leeway on where they are taxed, of course that creates opportunities. As a result, we see a lack of a level playing field between companies, between different types of companies, and a distortion of competition. It's also an issue for public budgets, at least in certain jurisdictions, and it creates a concern of fairness, also of social fairness. So there's a strong perception that this current state of play is not leading to fair outcomes. And as a result of that also, we see a risk within the EU of internal market fragmentation. And that's because individual countries somehow see the need to act, and since it's difficult internationally and globally to agree on reforms, some countries have started to put in place unilateral measures. And we see more of that and more being planned, and that of course creates complexity for companies, compliance costs, double taxation issues. So I will very briefly explain also some of the more quantitative elements that we've put out there. And one thing that we've looked at is the level of taxation different types of companies face. And I'd like to take the opportunity to point out that this is, so you see here, if you look at the multinational group, an effective average tax rate for a traditional business model of around 23%, and of the digital of 9.5%. And I'd like to point out that this is a theoretical model, so it looks at a hypothetical investment, and how much would that investment be taxed if we take into account detailed information about the taxation rules in the individual countries. So these figures are averages for the EU 28, but it's theoretical. So, and this is stylized business model, so a traditional business model that relies relatively more on physical assets, and a digital business model that relies more on intangible assets, has more higher levels of R&D, etc. And this is just to say that this lower level of taxation, to a great extent, is outcome of policies that are intentional. So they want to foster R&D, and to some extent it's also just because these companies, they rely less on tangible goods that need to be depreciated over time. They have more costs that are immediately deductible. But it's true that because you have also all these incentives that they can use and they benefit from, if you combine that with the fact that it's not so easy to capture their activity in each jurisdiction, and maybe there's a bit more choice to where they are taxed, of course, there's more opportunities for tax planning. So that's basically the idea behind presenting these numbers. We've also talked about the unilateral measures and the risk of fragmentation. So in the past years, we've seen each year a few countries, one or two at least each year, implementing unilateral measures or announcing that they would do so. And you see this here for the EU, but also for third countries. And if you look at cumulatively, you see really an increasing trend here. We also think that these issues are only set to grow. So this is just a figure to illustrate this issue is growing because the digital economy is growing. In 2006, only one of the top 20 companies was digital, and in 2017 it was already 9 of them, presenting more than 50% of market capitalization. So we've put out in March 2 proposals, and these 2 proposals, I assume you would put them in the corner of tailored change. One proposal we presented as a comprehensive solution to the problem, a solution that reforms the permanent establishment rules and profit attribution rights, and a targeted interim solution that is meant to be there as long as the comprehensive solution is not yet in place. So the objective behind the comprehensive solution, first of all, the preference is for a global solution, because if you want really to create a level playing field or restore a level playing field, it needs to be global. And the goal is to align again, or better align again, the place where value is created and where profits are created. And it's a solution that it stays within the existing corporate tax systems. So this was also, for us, the mandate we had. So from the member states, in a council conclusion in December, our mandate was to look for reforms within the international corporate tax system. So no fundamental reforms, essentially. So the comprehensive solution is a directive that has these 2 elements, so new rules for the nexus and for profit allocation. I would like to emphasize it's not a new tax, because sometimes, especially in the media, I think this is a bit misrepresented. It's really just reforming the allocation of taxing rights. The directive would apply between EU member states, but also vis-à-vis third countries where member states don't have bilateral tax treaties with third countries. And the first requirement for this significant digital presence is a digital interface. So a taxpayer needs to have a digital interface in a member state and users. And then what triggers the significant digital presence? It's if one of these 3 criteria here at the left is satisfied, so revenues from supplying certain digital services, so there's a definition of those digital services, exceeding 7 million euro in that jurisdiction, or more than 100,000 users, or more than 3,000 business contracts. And then there's also part on the profit allocation. So the idea there is to remain within the existing principles of a functional analysis based on risks, assets, and functions. And the proposal there is to go for a profit split method that would take into account via the data and users that contributed to the profit through the digital interface. Then we also have the interim measure, so that's a tax on revenue. And the rationale for putting that out there is that we think it will take a long time until a comprehensive solution is agreed and implemented. At the same time, we already see this trend towards unilateral action, which in a sense is the worst case of all cases because you create a lot of complexity and double taxation issues. We also think that as soon as you have created facts and you have these solutions in place, it will become more and more difficult to move to something else. Because countries tend to stick to their own solutions. Once they've adopted them, they like to keep them. And so the proposal here is, in a sense, for a harmonized interim solution. In this solution, it's also important to know that when we proposed it, that we had to deal with a number of constraints, really, because of course we need to respect the existing international legal framework. EU law, the fundamental freedoms. For example, we can't just discriminate between domestic and foreign companies. Other legislation like VAT, data protection. So it was not a possibility, for example, to simply increase VAT rates on certain digital services. International obligations or existing double tax treaties. That was one reason why we couldn't propose something that was more resembling a profit tax, because then we would have had the same constraints from the beginning, so back to square one, basically. WTO rules, and of course we also were closely involved with the OECD as well, because the ongoing work there meant that we wanted to put something out that doesn't in some way contradict the work in the OECD. So these are the design constraints, and in the end, what we had was a tax on revenue, an indirect tax. And in terms of the scope of the tax, we selected activities where we thought the current mismatch is the highest. And the rationale there was to say these are services that are subject to this new tax where user contribution is central to the provision of the service. So you cannot have that service without the contribution of the user, be it active or passive. So this is online advertising services, the sale of user data, and intermediation. So these are basically platforms that bring together different sides of a market and match different sides, be it buyers or sellers of goods or services or other things. So in these services, we see revenue basically as a value, as a proxy for value creation, but of course, we know it's not all driven by the user. There are other elements as well. It's a proxy. It's an interim solution, not ideal. The rate is 3% of gross revenues. Then we've proposed through two thresholds, 750 million euro of global consolidated turnover. And that revenue can be from any service. It doesn't have to be this taxable service, any kind of service of the group. And then 50 million of taxable services in the EU. And whatever is the taxable service in the EU, let's say it's 100 million, then would be split according to where the user is located. So in the same share. And then collection would be organized by a one-stop shop and reporting obligations, similar to VAT. And finally, I just want to put out a slide that explains a bit the whole package that we proposed. So on the one hand, you have the comprehensive solution, the Digital Presence Directive that would apply within the EU and vis-à-vis third countries without bilateral tax treaty. At the same time, we've issued a recommendation to member states to adapt the rules in the bilateral treaties with third countries in the same way. We would also then amend our CSDB proposal to reflect the new significant digital presence rules. And then in the interim period, the indirect tax, because it had to be an indirect tax, digital services tax. And then maybe finally to say that an important rationale behind this entire proposal was to also feed the global discussion on the issue and maybe even push it a little bit. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Second speaker is Peterson from the OECD and joins the head of aggressive tax planning.
So thank you, John, for inviting me here today. I did have some slides that I was preparing on the train from Paris on the way over here, and then after I went through them at the end, I decided that they were so utterly boring and derivative that I would have you all walking out through my presentation. So I have discarded with the slides, and I'm just going to give you, if I can, some observations, I think, by way of context on the work that was done leading up to the interim report, a bit of discussion of the interim report itself, and perhaps some indication of the future direction of the work. And the starting point is that I'm very pleased, of course, that the title of this conference is Taxing the Digitalised Economy, notwithstanding how difficult that is to say, because, of course, we say there's no such thing as the digital economy. And what we mean by that, it's not that the OECD thinks that the digital economy is a completely made-up thing, that Google and Facebook don't really exist, or that we have some kind of Socratic notion that only things that exist are those that can be adequately defined. It's more that the digital economy creates the idea that there is this separate sector of the economy, like energy or mining or banking or forestry, and that's not what digitalization is all about at all. This is a process, and it's happening across all sectors, and it's intensifying within those sectors, and it's changing the very nature of the markets themselves. So any idea that we could sort of identify some unique features and come up with some special taxing rules, we think, is a mistake. So we moved away from the nomenclature of the digital economy to this somewhat cumbersome phrase, digitalised economy. And having sort of taken that problem and turned it from one that's defined out of existence to one that applies across all sectors and is intensified and deep and broad, we have the situation where everyone agrees that this digitalised economy or this process is raising real challenges. All the delegates, or the countries I suppose, but it's the delegates in the room, agree that there are big challenges here, but they just don't agree on what those challenges are, and they don't agree on how they should be solved. And it was in that context that we were required to produce this interim report for the G20. And Georgia, who's sitting in the audience here, I think did an excellent job of framing this discussion, this divergent and diverse discussion. And what she did was she started talking about we need to get a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about highly digitalized businesses. And the report puts them into an existing context, an existing analytical framework that looks at existing analyses of business models. And that analysis then shows that, business models within the highly digitalized sector are all very different. They're not all the same, and they're not necessarily new in terms of their structure. And the analysis on value chain and value network and value shop and all the analysis in there shows that we can explain these phenomena in terms of our existing models. So that's the first step in the analytical framework. The second, and perhaps somewhat more controversial aspect of the analysis, is that a number of key features were identified for highly digitalized business models. And these are the ones that give rise to particular tax policy challenges. First, we all know this, is a reliance on intellectual property. The second is the lack of nexus in the source country. And then finally, the idea of user contribution and its role in value creation. So, having then got countries somewhat remarkably to sort of agree at least on what are the three key areas that need to be focused on in the context of this debate, Georgia was clever enough to organise these groups of countries into three groups, right? And again, this is well understood. We have one group that considers that we nailed it with user contribution, effectively, that the problem is the failure of the existing international architecture, and in particular the rules really dealing with nexus and profit allocation, to adequately account for the value contributed by users, both in terms of data, in terms of content, and in terms of participation. So that's one group, and they're focused on user contribution and the role it plays in value creation. There's another group that agrees that there are problems with nexus and profit allocation, but consider that those problems are not confined to digital. The problem is in fact a broader one. It's linked to the ability of multinationals to have economic involvement in a market jurisdiction with no or comparatively little tax presence or basis for allocating profit to those jurisdictions. And those countries also reject the idea that user contribution is a source of value creation. And then finally, there's another group that thinks there's no problem here. That's an overstatement of their position, but they think that to the extent there are problems, they really need to be understood as BEPS issues about double non-taxation. And they suggest that what we should do is get a better understanding of the impact of our existing BEPS measures before we start moving to new and additional policy solutions. So, amongst those groups then, you can see that the last two agree that the problems are not really confined to digital. Both the last two groups don't think that if there is something that needs to be addressed here, it's not a uniquely digital problem and doesn't have a uniquely digital definition or footprint. And the first two agree that there's something wrong with the current rules regarding allocation of taxing rights. So there is a diversity of view, but it's now beginning to be sort of organised into some firm understanding of where we all stand. And you could be left with the impression that nobody agrees on anything, not either on the nature or the scope of the problem or the solutions for addressing them, and therefore 2020 might be a little optimistic for a final report. But I am an optimist. And I'm an optimist, I think, for two reasons. The firstly is that the interim report was never intended to be a document with specific recommendations for changes. It was an interim report. That was what it was supposed to do, and it did its job well. It records countries' agreement that they will work together towards a solution and defines what the framework of the problem is for analysis. And that framework is important because it forces countries to articulate what their positions are and provide coherent justifications for them. And that's very important in the context of sitting in a room together and having a discussion about what to do next, that you have countries who have clearly expressed where they stand and they can see where they stand in relation to other countries. That is the basis that you need to begin a discussion about change. The second is that why I'm optimistic is because we never really agree at the OECD on the theoretical underpinning of the changes that we are making. We just try to seek to identify specific opportunities for changes to the framework. I think that this is evident in what happened in the BEPS project. I mean, we didn't need to agree what we meant by value creation in order to come up with the specific recommendations that we made in the BEPS projects for particular kinds of changes. So certainly the conceptual discussion is important, as I've explained, but it's not the core work of what we need to do going forward. The core work that we need to do, the nature of the problem that we need to solve, is we need to identify groups of countries that want to do A, B, C, and D, and there's another group of countries that want to do C, D, E, and F, and so we end up doing B, C, D, and E, and we make everybody kind of happy that this is sort of the kind of thing that they want. That's the way that we approach this problem at the OECD level. So those are my comments, I think, on the report, what it does, where we go now. I'm going to deliberately avoid discussing notions of user contribution and whether that and its role in value creation. I'm going to avoid discussing allocation of profit to the market jurisdiction and its relation to destination principles and all that stuff, because there are people in the room who've thought much more about those issues than I have. And also, as I've indicated, it's not, I don't think, necessarily the nature of the framework of the debate that we'll be having going forward. I would make a final set of observations around this third group that considers that perhaps the BEPS, what we have here is an issue of double non-taxation, and that we should wait to see what the impact of the BEPS measures is. I think it is fair to say that the discussion in the room is there are still, notwithstanding the changes that were made as part of the BEPS action plan, there are still gaps or issues that can arise in the application of the existing principles in terms of double non-taxation outcomes. But it's also true to say that a large number of the BEPS measures were transparency measures, effectively. And you can't measure the impact of a transparency measure until it's been implemented, the transparency comes through, and we see what change in behaviours there are. So I think that there is some cogent content to that third group and what they say, but I don't think it's necessarily we can assume that we have solved everything in BEPS. Finally, because I had the unhappy task of writing the chapter on interim measures for the digital economy report, I'll say a couple of things about interim measures. The report does not recommend interim measures, but that's not a polite way of saying don't do them. That's not what we're saying. It's just that we couldn't get agreement from the room on whether we should have interim measures or not. There are countries in the room that think interim measures are a good idea, and there are countries in the room that think interim measures are a terrible idea. So we end up with a report not recommending anything because we can't get agreement. So it's not that we are recommending not recommending you not have interim measures, it's just that we're not saying anything much about it at all. We do, I think, in the analysis of the interim measures, identify that the existing international tax architecture just places structural limitations on what you can do with the design of this tax. And those structural limitations make this tax clumsy. It is not a well-targeted tool. I think there's a consensus that that is right. It's just a fundamental limitation of the space that we find ourselves in if you were to go down this path. Which leads me, I guess, to two observations, and I guess they may be more political than policy, but the first would be that you can deal with some of those limitations by narrowing the scope of the measure. You can limit the impact of the measure by limiting the number of taxpayers it applies to or the transactions that apply to. But if your interim measure is intended to address the political concerns that are rising inside your country about the lack of taxation for highly digitalised businesses, then you'll equally have political pressure that's pushing you the other way. So one of the great tensions that the Commission and the member countries will now be dealing with is that pressure. Essentially that there is if you are responding to your own body politic by wanting to introduce an interim measure, that political response suggests that you need to go broader, but the limitations that you have in the design of the tax and the clumsy way it operates push you to go the other way. So there's a tension there. And that's a difficult one to balance, certainly what we found when we engaged in this discussion. And the second is that your view on the merits of interim measures turns very much on your view as to the prospects of a long-term solution, because you don't want to be going through this process of designing and trying to implement an interim measure if you think there is a better and more permanent solution just around the corner. So that there is a dynamic at play between interim measures and long-term solutions that is a complex one politically, I think. So those are the comments that I wanted to make in terms of the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And our third and final presentation for the first session is by Michael Lennard, who's the Chief of International Tax Cooperation at the United Nations.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking in my personal capacity because I'm now on sabbatical. I have to speak in my personal capacity, but I'll still say exactly the same things as I would have in my other capacity. What I'm going to do, I'm not going to read my slides, but I'm going to just pick out a few threads where the UN is, in some sense, starting to think about these issues, the UN Tax Committee, but also already has done some thinking on some of those issues. Just looking at this first slide, looking at the way the OECD report, which I think is a very valuable report, sees the characteristics of the digitalised economy. We find for a lot of developing countries, particularly the smaller ones, the data issue of user participation is probably less of an issue in the digitalised economy than the first two issues, the cross-jurisdictional scale without mass. They've been very preservative developing countries of the PE approach and taken fairly broad views of whether there's a permanent establishment. So they're, of course, very concerned about the effects of their revenue of big participations in their economy without actual physical presence as required by the traditional notions of the PE. And the second aspect, intellectual property, is a lot of concern for developing countries because they've often felt that intellectual property is being developed in their countries, including sort of finessing. An example I often think of is the Kit Kat bar. It's not a developing country, but the Kit Kat bar in Japan is a very different thing from the Kit Kat bar in the UK. It has a different sort of cultural resonance, and that happens in a lot of developing countries. Certain brands, certain names are picked up in those countries and given an additional value, which developing countries think is not always fully appreciated and given value to. So issues of intellectual property, particularly in transfer pricing, are very, very important for a lot of developing countries. And the profit split, the ways of dealing with profit splits is a manifestation of that, and how hard fought that was in the BEPS by developing countries to make sure that got sufficient resonance. So there is the data participation, the user participation issue, particularly if you're a large country with a big market. But for a lot of developing countries, the digitalised economy issues are some of those other issues which have been around for some time. The UN already has some form in the area of what is broadly the digitalised economy. First of all, we had the Services Permanent Establishment, which broke down some of the geographical and time aspects of the traditional permanent establishment rule in the context of services permanent establishments. There still has to be presence in your jurisdiction, but it's a little bit looser in terms of geography and in terms of time than the traditional norms. And that approach was actually later picked up in I think, what could be termed as a fairly bloody battle within the OECD by a minority of OECD member countries. My feeling is over time more and more we'll pick up the Services Permanent Establishment. And just last year we introduced into the UN model the Fees for Technical Services article. And that article really dispenses with the idea of the permanent establishment. The underlying idea is that providing a technical consultancy and managerial service into your country is sufficient engagement in your economy without actually any performance of work there. And that's been a clear dichotomy between the UN and the OECD, and that was a bloody battle in the UN to get a way of expressing that. It's only an option, and we have the pros and cons. But that, I think, is an important step forward for a lot of developing countries, realising the focus should be very much on the type of engagement in your economy, whether that's sufficient to be taxed, particularly in the split up of taxing rights under a double tax agreement. And it is worth remembering that even the PE rules in traditional OECD and UN provisions are not entirely pure. There's an artist and sports person provision which basically says if you're rock band, for example, and you're performing in Oxford, you don't really have to look at how long they're there. There's also traditionally been an approach that in some circumstances, because of the business cycles involved effectively, which is a current resonance, you can have an instant permanent establishment. It's a very tricky concept, but I think the permanent establishment principle, even under traditional ways of looking at it, was always slightly murky about what sort of engagement was sufficient. So the UN has a tax committee has set up, which is a majority developing country body, but includes a large number of OECD members, all effectively from government. One is not from government, but he was before he left to join the private sector. And they have a subcommittee which they've formed to look at issues for developing countries on income tax, on double tax agreements, and on VAT issues. Traditionally, the UN has not looked a lot at VAT issues, mainly because the people on the tax committee were treaty negotiators. It was actually hard to get them even to look at transfer pricing. But of course, it's such an important issue, and there's been some good work done on that. So there's a recognition that to deal with the digital economy, you do have to look at all the aspects of it. And its mandate is to suggest measures and to draft provisions. So really it's focusing particularly on what guidance it should give to developing countries. And a lot of that it won't be saying you should do this, you should do that. We never do that. But it's saying, well, if you're in this situation, you might find this useful, you might find this not useful. And what are the pros and cons? Because it's part of the UN system that we always look at these issues through the concept of development. What does it do for your development? You need revenue for your budgets, but you also need to have some sort of attractive climate for investment. So there will be, I would predict, this work is only really starting at the moment, and the approach will be, first of all, to analyse. We have very little resources, so it always has to be very, very focused. But initially there will be some examination of the business models that exist out there and what they mean for developing countries. And I think there will be a heavy reliance on some pretty good work on the business models, which was done by the OECD in its interim report. Then the key point is, well, what does this mean for countries at different stages of development with different policy perspectives? And you might think that the Inclusive Forum will deal with all that the OECD, I think it's 116 countries or so now, that will consider all these issues. But as I'll speak to in a minute, there is a concern amongst a lot of developing countries that everything is moving so quickly and these things are so technically difficult and they're so resource-strapped that even though they're in the inclusive framework, they may not be able to make sure that their concerns are sufficiently articulated. And this is an important role in the UN to try to articulate those views as well as possible, and hopefully they'll coincide with what the OECD is doing, and they may even hopefully feed into what the OECD is doing. But the first phase of the work will probably be getting developing countries to say, well, what are your concerns? Do you think that value is created, which is not being picked up by traditional ways of looking at value creation? Or do you think there needs to be a change? Those two longer-term issues which we'll be discussing a lot of today. And the approach of the UN, this is the normal approach, is that we don't tell you what to do, but we talk about the pros and cons, and they may vary depending on which stage of development you are, what resources you have, and what your priorities as a country are, which is also important. How much you really just want that investment at any cost, or how much you have a more nuanced approach of saying, well, we do want that investment, we want our people to get more digitalised, to get more up with technology, but we really think that our budgets, our education systems and so forth need to recognise more the profit that we believe is being built in this country. And the main thing for us is that the process and the outcomes be transparent, because I personally doubt you'll get a complete consensus on the longer term issues in this area. And in a sense, to me, that actually may not even be the right result, a consensus. If a consensus means one set of rules for all countries, even if they're in different positions, maybe that's not the right way to do it. If a consensus means recognising there may be different ways and different timings in order to achieve the right outcome, then that's the sort of consensus that we seek in the UN. And the main thing for us is if there are different tracks, different approaches that you can't resolve, the important thing is transparency of the decisions that you've taken as a government, and also making sure you keep your promises, pacta sunt servanda. And hopefully it will end up with sufficient balance of certainty for taxpayers and for budgets. There's so much emphasis on certainty for taxpayers, but of course governments also want some sort of certainty that where profits are being, where value is being created in their country, that the budget will reflect that. On the interim measures, I think that a lot of the UN countries are very, very interested in interim measures. They're partly because they may not be sure that the consensus will occur in time, or that it will be sufficiently detailed, but also they feel they're losing out at the moment. And I think some of the countries that have already brought in interim measures, like India, for example, I think they're keen to have other developing countries follow their suit and give some solidarity on something such as the equalisation levy. There is an issue for developing countries on whether, if you have a withholding tax, and in the UN, developing countries really like withholding taxes. They're blunt instruments, but they tend to be, if you've got very limited resources, to be something that can be administered more easily than some other more complex ways of dealing with things. And of course there's the risk that if you set it at too high a level, it'll be just grossed up and your consumers will be the detriment in dealing with others from other countries that don't have such a tax. But that's an issue for all withholding taxes. That's an issue for royalties, for example. Indirect taxes, as I say, the UN will be dealing with that, and that's something where again, there's been a lot of good work done, but I think it's an important phase for the UN that will be looking more and more at indirect taxes, and digital is an important part of that. Now, I want to talk about some of the geopolitics of this, because I think it's very important when you talk about if there's a consensus that emerges out of the inclusive framework. You do have to recognise that there are some different views about the nature of the inclusive framework. First of all, the inclusive framework, it's a very large number of countries, 116. It was set up basically not as a policy-making body, though, as an implementing body, and developing countries are very aware of that. And very aware that it hasn't really, for example, the OECD, the developing countries weren't really involved when the OECD action plan came out. The non-OECD countries came in later, and there are some, a lot of good work was done within BEPS, a lot of good work is being done on the digital economy, but I don't think you can just look at the number of countries in the inclusive framework and say, well, there's a consensus on this, therefore countries will feel bound by it. One of the issues that we hear back sometimes for developing countries is, yes, I'm participating in the inclusive framework work, but there's so much to come to deal with that we haven't been able to actively participate. We're not really sure about the results because we haven't had the chance to fully analyse them. There's also the issue of the depth of participation. Some developing countries say, well, in effect, the work is really being run by a smaller group of countries, and that affects, our ability to feel that this is fully reflecting us being at the table. We're at the table, but we don't always feel that we can participate as deeply as others because of resourcing, because of familiarity with the issues, and for other reasons. I mentioned the mandate of the inclusive framework being for implementation, basically, rather than policy setting. And again, there's some feeling is this the right way to deal with what could be creation of a new policy. And again, the timing of participation, the fact that a lot of developing countries have come to this issue, as a lot of other BEPS issues, quite late. And of course, there's a limitation to the extent to which you can be involved. Now, I'm not saying, I think there's some great work being done. We're very supportive of the inclusive framework. I'm very supportive of it. But don't just see the 116 countries and assume that everyone in there is feeling that they're fully engaged. The report on the digital taxation was originally the work of the task force on the digitalised economy, and now it's the output of the inclusive framework. But there are issues when you look, as you know, will work be subcontracted to Working Party 1 and Working Party 6 of the OECD, of which developing countries are not full members? For example, how much work will the OECD Secretariat do on this? And the OECD Secretariat, there's not a lot of developing country people in that, and only in certain areas constitutionally. So there are some issues about ensuring that the inclusive framework report, even if it's signed up to by 116 countries, that they really feel that they are bound by it. And just my final point is sort of a little bit of an international lawyer's point, because I think it's important to this area, are, you know, when you look at the interim measures in the interim report, there's some agreement as to design principles which have to be followed. One, pretty obviously, is that it shouldn't be inconsistent with your international obligations. That's always, it's interesting to a country like Australia, because you can actually do something contrary to your international obligations in domestic law. You have to account for the fact that you've breached your international obligations, but courts are obliged to follow a clear message from the Parliament. And what would be the case in this situation, in that circumstance? So there is an issue about the fact that the design principles in the Inclusive Framework report, to what extent are countries bound by those at the moment? Will they be raised in domestic procedures as something where they are contrary to an undertaking that has been made in an important forum? And finally, I've noticed increasingly in the last few years that people have talked about a customary international law of international taxation. Will there be an argument that if 116 countries have signed up to something that even other countries are bound by that? As an international lawyer, I don't think that holds at the moment, because you've got a lot of state practice, but to have customary international law in any field, you also need what's called opinio juris, the sense that you're following it because you are bound to anyway, even if you hadn't signed up to the Inclusive Framework report. But there are some really interesting issues which developing countries will be churning over time of in signing up to these sorts of reports. To what extent have we bound, and to what extent have we had a chance to seriously consider these? The role of the UN effectively in this and other areas will be to help developing countries work out what the options are for them in their situation, and to put forward the arguments of developing countries and to make sure that they're properly represented. But when that's done, it is always in the sense that we recognise that for most developing countries, they have chosen to have development that comes not just through money coming into the revenue, but also through encouraging the right sort of investments as part of their investment plans. And that, of course, if you don't have any investment, you won't get any money into the revenue anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. So we have up to half an hour for questions and some discussion now. And there are roving mics going around. So head there. Please, could you, before asking your question or making your comment, could you give us your name and the institution or organization you work for?
Heather Self at Blick-Rothenberg. It seems to me that the OECD is doing a great job of trying to hold back the tide, but what's happening in the EU and other countries shows just how difficult that is, and I fear we're going to get a lot of interim measures. My question is whether we are actually focusing too much on corporate tax. It's interesting that the EU felt they couldn't have a profits tax because that would cause all sorts of treaty problems, so instead they've opted for a turnover tax. The EU does, of course, have a turnover tax, it's VAT. The EU already has proposals to move fully to the destination principle for VAT, and I note in passing that we've had an interim system for VAT since 1992. Could I ask the panel whether they think the focus is too much on direct tax for the digitalised economy?
Okay, we should collect a couple of questions before passing them on to the panel. So, any other questions?
Thanks, Judith Knott. I just wanted to pick up on something that John said about the fact that what the OECD is trying to do is not necessarily get underlying conceptual agreement between countries, and I can see there's a lot in that because what we're about is not philosophical but actually practical and coming up with practical proposals. But then if you do look at opportunities for change, and I think you mentioned you might be able to get agreement on B and F, but how do you then ensure that what you've got is a coherent whole? Because if you adopt that sort of strategy, you might just get sort of ragbag of things that can be agreed on.
Okay, let's try to answer these first two questions, and then we'll have another round of questions, hopefully. Who would like to start? Michael?
I might start on the issue of whether there's too much emphasis on the income tax, the corporate income tax, and of course VAT is very important in this area, and some good work has been done. But from the developing country perspective, it is worth remembering that corporate income tax is more important than it is for a lot of developed countries. And the other thing we find is, of course, there's public expectation. There is still a strong public expectation that if we have to pay our taxes, and a lot of developing countries are putting a lot of emphasis into so-called tax culture, saying you need to pay your taxes to build up your country. If they look across and see megaliths that they think should be paying taxes, then rightly or wrongly, and there's always issues about whether they're getting the right information, they will respond to that. And of course, you've got more active NGOs. So even from those perspectives, I think it's very important, particularly for developing countries, that corporate income tax be seen to be an important part of this perspective, especially as areas like avoidance of PEs and IP issues have been seen as, by a lot of developing countries, as areas where the system has been gamed.
Yeah, I would like to say on this issue as well, maybe it's also important to keep in mind that the problem arises in corporate taxation. So therefore, I think it's difficult to focus entirely on solutions in indirect taxation, while leaving the corporate tax system and its problems as is. So I think that's also not sustainable in the end, because you would patch it up with something that is unrelated. Yeah.
So, yes, in response to Heather's question, I think, there was, of course, a substantial amount of work done. Perhaps didn't get necessarily the same amount of media as the corporate income tax side, but substantial amount of work done in the context of the BEPS project, specifically in the digitalisation of the economy and taxation, indirect taxation and value-added taxes. And that's, I think, led to some important improvements in, or has been part of the overall process, leading to important improvements, particularly in the taxation of B2C on the destination basis, and also in relation to low value goods. And I think, having worked on this interim measures, I'm certainly sympathetic to some of the elements that you say. I think one of the things that we identified when we looked at the work on interim measures was it was very difficult to predict where the incidence of tax would fall in relation to a turnover tax in the abstract, and you had a sneaking suspicion that this was going to end up performing very much a similar economic function to a value-added indirect tax. And of course that's driven by by the structural limitations on what you can do in relation to the interim measure. As to whether, it's also true to say that corporate income tax is a vanishingly small part of the overall revenue for many of the governments involved. And if you were to look at the amount of money that they were generating from other sources of taxation, this is not necessarily where we would be spending and focusing all our efforts. But I do think that there is an underlying political narrative here, which is around, ultimately, I guess, taxing returns on capital. Corporate income tax is perhaps the only model that maybe a clumsy model, maybe a bad one, but it seems to be the only one that we have for taxing returns on capital. And there is a concern amongst certain countries, they've stated it quite explicitly, about the race to the bottom in this space. And so in the absence of a model, a better and more coherent model for taxing capital, there is a big political focus on getting corporate income tax, the model that we have, to work in this new environment. So I think that's why we seem to be spending a large amount of time discussing something where you would actually stand back and looking at it from a revenue, perhaps in a design perspective. This is not the most obvious tool to pick up and try and use. In relation to coherence, it's a good question. How do you pull all this stuff together? And coherence is important, and I think again the BEPS project was an indication of how that was done, because we brought things under the umbrella of value creation. It's a concept that we never got down to try and define in terms of the specifics, but we sort of said what we're doing is trying to align taxation with value creation. And a big part of that statement was about what we were not doing. So at that time, what we were not doing was reallocating taxation rights. That was, by aligning taxation with value creation, we were making it clear that this wasn't a fundamental discussion about residence versus source. We're now having a different discussion with a slightly different frame of reference, where questions about residence versus source and allocation of taxing rights are on the table. But now the question will be, well, what kinds of taxing rights in relation to what kinds of activity, in relation to what kinds of structures? So it will be possible, I guess, once the project comes to fruition and the specific areas are identified, it's then possible to identify an underlying umbrella concept that explains or gives some reality to what's being done as an exercise. I guess I'd also make the observation that if you adopt a specific measure, you end up addressing simultaneously a number of policy concerns. If you, for example, reallocate taxing rights to the market jurisdiction, you pretty much eliminate the BEPS concerns associated with returns on those kind of payments, because you have simply reallocated the taxing rights into the market jurisdiction, and if the source jurisdiction wants to tax them, it can. So a single measure can answer a number of different policy framework problems that are being presented.
Can I just add a little bit on coherence, is that sometimes coherence can be at the expense of fairness. I hope I'm not the first person to use the F word here, but it really is important. There's naturally going to be some attack on coherence, particularly with new players in the system, like the Brazils and the Indias and the Chinas and a lot of other developing countries. It is harder to get a more fully accepted and coherent response. And just on coherence, an example, transfer pricing, the OECD work on transfer pricing now is arguably less coherent than it used to be, but I think it's a lot fairer. Most of the iterations in recent years, there used to be an approach in the OECD that safe harbours were inconsistent with the arm's length principle, and therefore they were frowned upon. but, you know, they're optional to the taxpayer, so what's the problem with that? And I think more practical approaches, they may attack the coherence a bit. There was never great coherence on treatment of intellectual property or on permanent establishments, to be honest, more in theory than in reality. But in attacking those, I think you can actually have more pragmatic solutions that are likely to get more real acceptability in the field, which I think is important to multinationals, not just what countries signed up to, but what that means in the field. And the second point is sometimes complete consensus, complete coherence may not be the final goal. And if you do have a lack of coherence, the remedy to that is transparency. Transparency, and as I've said, the sense of obligation and sometimes a lack of coherence, which is more pragmatic and seen as fairer in terms of nation equity, will lead to more of vows being kept in reality. So it's a complex interplay. Thank you.
There are two questions there, and then we'll try to answer them. Yeah.
Thank you. Alexander Ivanovsky, Queen Mary University of London. I have a question for the Commission. It's quite technical. It concerns Article 5 and the profit attribution rationale of the Directive on Digital PE. It seems at the outset that this is at variance with the OECD authorized approach and effectively introduces voluntary apportionment, albeit with one single factor, which is user contribution. So can you please explain how does this work in the context of the arm's length principle, and perhaps from a policy side, how would this tie in with the recent CCTB letter from Germany and France? Thank you.
So thank you. There's one more question. So Valeska, we'll address the first part of that question in the third session. So you might want to talk about CCTB, and we'll address the next. Yeah.
Sarah Luder from Slaughter and May. This may, I hesitated this on the basis of maybe a very ignorant question, but are we really confident that this is a different business? I do remember when e-commerce first started and we had this huge debate about e-commerce being very different from bricks and mortar businesses, and what's actually turned out is there is no difference. I mean, are we not going to see all businesses moving into this digital area? And is there a risk that by taxing digital businesses differently, we start distorting development of business, development of conventional businesses into a more digital area? And how do we get comfortable on that?
Okay, so let's address those questions. Actually, I want to build on the last question in two ways. So firstly, the Commission and others have written about the need to have rules which are future-proof. And when we have rules which try to ring-fence the digital economy or some highly digitalized businesses, I do wonder, how complex will these rules be? How much uncertainty will they create? And also whether we'll need to update these rules regularly to keep up with technological change. I mean, because clearly, we probably can't even imagine what type of technologies we'll be dealing with in 5 or 10 years' time. And another point which builds up on Sarah's question is maybe directed to you, John. So I've heard a number of OECD officials talk about the need to talk about the digitalization of the economy, it is hard to say, rather than highly digitalized businesses. And that always made me wonder, does this mean there is a preference for the view of the countries saying that we should look at the system as a whole and not just highly digitalized businesses, or is the OECD completely neutral on this? Okay, so those are quite a few questions. Would you like to start, Valeska?
Yes, I would like to start maybe with the first one on the incidents, because that's one I've heard a lot. I don't find it maybe the most relevant one, and that's because it's true, actually, we don't know a lot about the economic incidence of taxation in general, and in particular of corporate taxation. So there are economic studies about that, and some say, about 50% of that actually, the incidence is on the employees, on the wages. But I think it's not the first worry about the reform where the incidence is, because that's a general issue. So we want to have all corporations being taxed at a level playing field, so in a similar way. And then the secondary issue is, okay, where does the incidence lie? And if we have an issue overall with our tax system, corporate taxation, VAT, other taxes, and the incidence, maybe something much more fundamental has to change. But this is about creating the same conditions for different types of companies. So for us, it's not necessarily the first concern.
Yeah, Michael?
Just a couple of things on that. Yeah, first of all, I think it is a very important issue as to the incidence of taxation and the implications that can have for your future. You know, whether you're going to discourage getting that expertise into your country, whether your people are going to be less competitive internationally. Ultimately, it's up to a country to make those decisions, and the most that can be said is the more evaluation there is of that, the more valuable it is in helping them make those decisions. I know that all the talk you hear at the moment on the equalisation levy from India is how much money it's brought in over the last 2 years, and quite a lot. But is there a countervailing effect? Ultimately, India has to decide that, but I think anything that can be done, I think more studies on these sorts of things would certainly be maybe helpful to those who are at least saying, consider before you do this. On the double non-taxation of MNEs, well, as I say, I think that ties in with the partly the public perception that not enough taxation is occurring with MNEs without necessarily understanding their business models. But I think it is true that countries, if they think that an M&E is not being taxed, then they will want to look for what value has been created in their country and analyse that. But it is, and that was part of the BEPS, I think, that the feeling that you shouldn't be taxed nowhere. So it is certainly an important operative provision. But for us, particularly in developing countries, there is suspicion of MNEs. And one of the best things we can do, I think, in the UN is make sure that where there's a response to that suspicion of MNEs, that the MNEs which are trying to do the right thing are not getting caught up in rules that are meant to address the MNEs not trying to do the right thing. There's a lot of risk management in that.
Okay, so I won't touch more on the issue of economic instance because I think that's been covered by the other speakers. I think on the double non-taxation point, Michael, I think that, I mean, clearly, of course, whether you think that this is a double non-taxation issue or an allocation of taxing rights issue, the solutions you come up with are going to end up, in one sense, fixing the other problem. If you allocate all the rights to the market jurisdiction, of course, then there's no opportunities there again for double non-taxation. Equally, if we eliminate the double non-taxation in the system, we remove the incentives for countries to base and profit strip. So in one sense, when you boil down to the sort of the answers that you are going to get countries to agree on, in one sense that the basis on which you're doing it can be a shared basis, or you might come from different conceptual standpoints. On the US tax reform, in particular the guilty, I think that that's an interesting question, and it's certainly one that gets raised a lot now. It's actually, of course, you realise that we have the guilty now, and it's a model that other countries are interested in now that the United States has taken that significant step. The challenge, I think, around the design of the guilty is going to be the crediting of foreign tax credits in its design, which is going to make it less effective as a means to protect the source country from base stripping. I will be able to, as a US company, utilise foreign tax credits from high tax jurisdictions to shelter my income from low tax jurisdictions. So I think that is an element of the guilty that means that perhaps the problem has not quite been solved necessarily by the US tax reform in the minds of the delegates. As for Sarah's question on digital businesses and how certain we can be, I think it's precisely right. I think that the starting point from the OECD is precisely the one that you've articulated, which is it would be foolish to think that we can define the digital economy as being a particular sector with these particular features, and then come up with special measures for addressing that for precisely the reasons that you articulate. I think the concept of an interim measure is more focused on a particular sector of highly digitalised business models that we know are happening now, that where there is immediate political demands to do something, and so we need to do something in the context of the existing design of the system. That then only makes sense if you genuinely believe that this is an interim measure on the way towards a long-term solution. Because if you lock in that interim measure, then you will have precisely the situation you describe, which is you end up having a tax that no longer fits the economic and legal environment in which you find yourself operating. And then as to whether there is somehow expressing a preference on the part of the OECD in terms of how we articulate the issues, the answer is no. And I think it's for the reasons that I've said, which is that we're not really looking for to buy any particular theory here. What we're looking for is specific examples of how we might be able to address the problems that countries are identifying. I think finally there was a question up top around the relationship between the rules under the AOA and the allocation to permanent establishments. Not my area, being not a treaty nor a transfer pricing person, but I think it would be fair to say that one of the things we learned out of the BEPS project, that it was probably a mistake separating out the definition of permanent establishment from the rules dealing with allocation of taxing rights. And if we had our time, we would have done it differently again. So you would expect that certainly if we approach that problem, we would deal with those things together and maybe put the allocation of taxing rights first, because that's probably the harder one, and then you can work out how you're going to deal with your nexus issues. But that seems relatively sensible and straightforward as a piece of learning from the outcomes from BEPS.
Just on that, the UN has, I think, probably quite sensibly rejected the authorised OECD approach. It's not really working well for developing countries.
Yes, and we'll return to this issue actually in the third session of the question of allocating profit to PEs. So I'd like to thank our speakers on this panel, and we'll now have a break of half an hour and return at 11:30 for presentations by representatives of ministries of finance of the UK, Germany, Ireland, and we'll have a US tax academic who's going to present the US view, so that promises to be a really interesting session. Please join me in thanking the participants on this panel.